We'd like to thank the following sponsors for helping provide this video.
Tonight's topic on Agile and high assurance challenges, which is a slight broadening of the topic dedicated to using Agile in the medical device industry. So we've asked our speakers to broaden that. Tonight's speakers are Nancy B. And she lets us call her B because she's the only one who can pronounce her last name. And Nancy is a recognized expert in using Agile in embedded systems, and was one of the first engineers to actually do that successfully. And she has been coaching teams and organizations and enterprises for about 15 years. And Brian Shoemaker, who is one of the area's experts in using Agile in the medical device industry and in regulated industries as well. And I'll let them tell you more about themselves during the talk. So, welcome Nancy, welcome Brian.
To drive the point home by talking about this is that Agile applied where you can kill somebody. And that's not a complete joke, actually, because as you'll see from the list of industries, we'll talk about it in a second. We had a little bit of a discussion there. I had an interesting time talking to Michael right before about this interesting series of kinks in the career. I don't know if anybody else in this room has possibly experienced that. You all look like you've had enough experience to have had to survive a few of those. I'm originally a chemist, analytical chemist specifically, which then got me a job in the immunodiagnostics industry where I worked for 15 years. But a merger, which was really a buyout, put me in a position of, well, I got to figure out what I'm going to do when I grow up. So I was taken in the last of those 3 jobs. In that time, I was actually a software quality person in the validation of software on an immunodiagnostic instrument. So I said, well, let's take the software validation stuff forward. But it turned out to be a good idea to stay close to home, which meant the FDA-regulated industry. So I've been doing that with a hiatus to do a hired-in job in clinical trial data management. And I've been doing this sort of thing on my own now for a good 9 or 10 years.
I'm Nancy Van Schooenderwoert, but you can call me Nancy V. I started my career as an electrical/computer engineer working on flight simulation. And I've gone on to work in a number of different safety critical applications since then. But you know, early on, my first 7 years, I worked in an environment where the same group of people did the hardware and the software. It never occurred to me that it made any sense for different departments to do those 2 things. And some of the fellows who I worked with when I first went there were still telling stories about how they worked on the Apollo 13 rescue, because our company had all the NASA contracts and most of the big airlines. So we got a lot of experience working on a number of different kinds of aircraft and going through audits, making software and hardware play together, all that type of thing. And I've worked in defense projects since then, really huge projects, other embedded systems, factory control, expanding factories, automating the equipment, instrumentation, some medical projects as well. And in fact, one of my first Agile teams in the late 1990s, Ron was on that team. And we were building a generic instrument, and once we were into building it, we got told, oh, they want to use it for a medical device now. So all of a sudden, we had to orient ourselves and go through those audits, or at least get ready to do that. But we were in a good position to do it because we were already using really solid principles and really solid practices with extreme programming, which was starting to get a name then. And we actually began with the Agile practices before there was any Agile community, though, because it was something I had learned just experience picked up as a contractor, learning from other teams that I worked on. So, but one of the things I'd like to say is something that I noticed all the time was the amount of waste, the amount of confusion, and the amount of one hand not knowing what the other's doing, even in really serious applications where you can launch nuclear weapons, things that serious. And audits are necessary, but they can't be the only safety net. You have to build the quality in. And so that's why I got interested in ways to do that.
I've been following the recall and manufacturer information picture for medical devices and similar kinds of things for some number of years now. And it's amazing the number of companies that have very good products out there that have some of the stupidest recalls in the world. And if we just take a look at the sort of broad outline of how this has been going on, I'll be completely honest with you. The growth in the total number of recalls, the red bars, to some extent mirrors the number of products that have software in them or are software products. I mean, some things which class as medical devices are pure standalone software. But there's more to it than that. Things keep happening over and over and over again. There's 3 classes of recalls. I had to multiply to class 1, the most serious ones, by 10 to be able to put them on the graph. But it's the same idea. It's not declining. It's not getting better with time. That's certainly the case. And it doesn't have to be this way. And Nancy will pick up and show from some actual hard data how it can be much better.
Yes, it just doesn't have to be like this. We can really do a lot better. There's a lot of metrics now that show Agile teams doing much better on the quality front. It just so happens that they finish projects faster as well, but I see that as a side effect of quality. And I'll explain that some more as we go along. I want to show you some data that comes from Michael Ma of QSM. And that's a company out in Western Mass. And Michael Ma has been here to speak. How many people have been to hear Michael? Yeah, I see quite a few hands. Okay. Yeah, he's been in the area more than once to give talks. And if you look at these charts, you'll see that at the center of the chart, on the log scale, there are projects that are around 100,000 lines of code. We take an average of about 10 months to complete. And those projects with the red dots, those are Agile projects, 3 of them that were studied at a Canadian medical systems company that Michael consulted to. And that same company had a couple of traditional projects. And the thick line going across the middle, that's the industry average. And the lighter lines near it are the 1 sigma variance. And you can see from this chart that the Agile projects were finishing quicker, okay, so better speed. The traditional projects were also quicker than average, so not too bad, right? And this is based on a comparison with around 12,000 projects in QSM's database. So if you're like me and people tell you they're finishing in significantly less time, you wonder, what are they giving up to do that? Are they skipping anything they shouldn't skip, in other words? So let's take a look at quality. Here's the same 5 projects again, but notice that the traditional projects are doing worse than average on the quality department, at least in terms of bugs found during code and test. And by the way, for all these projects, bugs found after delivery were very insignificant. The Agile projects are below, in other words, much fewer bugs than the average. And that's been my experience too with my own teams. My own early Agile team, we were averaging for the whole team fewer than 2 bugs in a whole month, and then we sustained that for 3 years. So this is not unusual, and I've met lots of other teams that experience those kinds of safety levels, or quality levels, I should say. So these things are possible. This is not a fluke. Michael Ma says that on average, he can assume that an Agile team will have about 1/4 as many defects as a non-Agile team, just from the data in this database. So there's that old saw about you can have it better, faster, or cheaper, pick any 2, and you can't have all 3, right? Everybody's heard that. Well, you can have all 3. We're here to say that you can. It's been demonstrated. And what we want to talk about today, though, is some of the mechanisms that actually get you there. All right, so we're going to break that rule. I also want to make a note here about how this applies to other types of regulated fields besides medical. As I mentioned earlier, I worked in aviation, I've worked in industrial controls, instrumentation, and defense too. And all these regulatory bodies to the best of my knowledge, I haven't worked under every single one of them, but I've worked in 3 of the areas. They don't try to prescribe what method you use. They take an approach where they're holding you to a certain standard. They're making sure you're doing some of the things you're saying you're doing, as far as quality checks and so forth. So auditing is necessary in that sense. I'm not saying to do away with it. I just know that it is nowhere near as thorough as when you've built the quality in the ways we're going to talk about. But everything we're going to say today here is also valid in these other fields. Okay, so we'll come to, and we'll be happy to entertain questions as well as we can. All right. Let's pause for a minute and say, suppose you were looking from outside, from the 30,000 foot level, like Michael coming in, measuring these companies, and you asked, what's really going on? You might notice that, okay, feature ideas get hatched, software and hardware gets built and put together, then they tend to have to go through some sort of a test and fix cycle because they can't release their products until they're up to snuff, right, and can pass an audit. So they tend to have this varying length cycle of getting it up to snuff if they didn't avoid the defects right from the start. And then the product goes out. But as we've seen from the chart that Brian showed, the defects are still getting out. In fact, about twice as many recalls are happening now in the past 3 years than were happening before. If you look from that high-level view also at an Agile project, you might say, okay, feature ideas happen, hardware and software get built. Some sort of a highly effective thing must be happening because the product is coming out cleaner. So you might get curious about what's in that box that I'm showing here with the orange question mark in it. And you might want to know what else could be there. Not only that, not only is it cleaner, somehow it has a time effect because these projects are finishing a lot faster. So you might get even extra curious now about what's going on. How can these projects actually be doing more? In other words, they're more effective at taking bugs out, and yet they're delivering faster. So it just seems like physics is getting broken somehow, doesn't it? All right, well, what we're going to do now is we figure we'd like to break out some of the mechanics of what goes into this and take away some of the mystery. And these are not the only foundations in Agile. There are others, and we'll mention them later. But these are really important, and because they bridge the gaps. They bridge across the silos that are so much a core part of the problem in companies. So we're going to talk about impact mapping, and then we're going to talk about iterative safety analysis, and then we're going to talk about story mapping. And after that, we'll wrap up with some remarks. Okay? And so we're coming up where Brian's going to take a turn and go over impact mapping for us, and also the iterative safety analysis.
Back before I became familiar with what the Agile approach is, one of the things that really bothered me about software validation, which is what I had been doing when I was at the diagnostics company, was that it was always viewed as being one like, yeah, we got to do that, so we got to do that, but that doesn't add any value. It's just the sort of thing we sort of tack on at the end. And I kept thinking, there's got to be more business value than that in this activity, especially because it's so important to the overall safety of products. And when I first was exposed to the Agile approach, when I came over to Nancy's place and saw a test bed being used and realized that Agile kind of blends testing and other kinds of activities right into the development process, the light bulb went off. I said, yes, this is the thing that needs to be there. Well, a similar light bulb went off when Nancy and I attended the Agile XP 2013 in Vienna, in Austria, because I went to a session where a presenter showed the blending of impact mapping and how it flowed down into a story mapping approach. Now, I'm going to take only the first part of that. And this is the reference, and in fact, she's putting out a couple of these books as part of the raffle this evening. I won't go into too many details. And in fact, in order to put this talk together originally, we went to the author of the book and said, what about this? And he gave some very useful thoughts back that allowed us to tweak the impact map and make it look more like the kind of thing that needs to be done. I've been exposed to way too many marketing requirements documents, marketing input documents, product requirements documents, or whatever you want to call them, and seen how really, really helpful they can sometimes be to a team that says, What do we build? What is it that needs to happen here? I'm seeing a head nodding in the back of the room. I think there have been a number of people here who have had the same experience. And this approach, to me, should be used as a replacement for the typical marketing input kind of a thing. And what are the keys? There's a why. What is the overall goal? Can we distill down into a single thesis statement what it is this development is supposed to achieve for us that has a business value? Who are the people, the types of roles that can aid or hinder in us achieving that? Oh, thanks. How do we want to impact those people, those actors, so that they will be able to help us achieve that goal? And what is it that we want to provide that has that impact? What are the features that, how do we want to support those impacts? So I'll use as a case study a product that I actually worked on doing the 510K for, the FDA submission for several years ago. TENS stands for transcutaneous electrical neural stimulation. You have a box of some sort that puts out an electrical signal, very, very low voltage electrical signal that's pulsating. And that's applied to electrodes on the person's skin, therefore the cutaneous, the transcutaneous. And it's a way of relieving pain. And it can be exceedingly effective. Now, there are over-the-counter versions. As it happened, the particular one that we were working on, trying to get the FDA clearance for, was one that's to be used clinically. So it had more capabilities, and it had more modes, and so on and so forth. But you have certain kinds of inputs that the clinician gives, certain kinds of feedback that the clinician sees. Certainly there's impedance from the patient, that the feedback of the instrument, in response to the energy output that the person is getting. And so there's a safety impact that's a very important element to it in terms of the design, and it's more than just the software. Here are the examples. This is the one we worked on. As I say, this is a system for use in a clinician's office. The other ones you see are over-the-counter type of things that you can go down to Walmart or CVS or whatever and buy. And you notice that this one, the electrodes are built right into a belt. That happens to be a safety element because, as I'll talk about later on, you don't want to be applying a pulsating voltage any place above the neck, or the head or neck. That can cause spasms. So that's actually a built-in safety design. And I'll be coming back to that area in a minute. The goals of TENS are twofold, like any medical device. It has to be effective and it has to be safe. It has to relieve pain and it can't harm the patient. It can't burn or shock the patient in any way. So you notice what I just did. I took a high-level goal and translated it down into the specifics for a particular system or particular application. So here's where the impact map comes in. What is our goal? I had to make something up, but it's reasonable. We want to sell 2,000 units. We want to have this be accepted in enough doctors' offices that we can sell this many units in 3 years. Put the right number, whatever numbers you want to it, but it has to be a business goal. All right? Who are the people that can have an impact and can help or hinder us reaching that? Physicians who would adopt it, physicians who would recommend it, patients who can say, hey, this thing was the greatest thing, it made my ankle pain go completely away. Certainly the regulator, because the person who has to review this thing is going to have to be able to say, yeah, I believe you, that's safe, you've done all the isolating that you need to do, you have shutoffs, you have this and that and the other thing, and you have people in the field support and so on and so forth that have to buy in to say, yeah, we can work with this instrument. What are the things that we need to do so that those people will then be able to help you get to your goal? A physician has to know that he or she can adopt this thing with confidence. That's the impact we need to have. A patient can't be shocked or burned, all right, and has to experience that lasting pain relief and would be willing to put up a testimonial. And certainly a regulator has to grant a clearance, has to be satisfied with the safety information. And so there have to be features of various kinds that I'll show in this diagram in a second that would then bring about those impacts. So let's start bringing them on here. Here's our high-level goal, to sell that number of instruments in 3 years. So we've got physicians, we've got patients, we've got a regulatory body. In Europe, it would be the notified body doing the inspection and so forth. And then finally, we've got our support and so forth. Physician is give that person the confidence in this system, adopting this system as a way of bringing about patient chronic pain relief. For the patient, there need to be two different things that we're going to be doing. There's no concern about injury, about being shocked or burned, and the pain relief is palpable. It happens, and in fact, it's lasting. The regulatory body, obviously, we need to get the regulatory body to grant the clearance so that we're allowed to market the thing in the first place. That's the way that 510Ks work. And there are going to be other things in terms of support that I could go into, and a bigger map would have those on them. So in terms of relieving the pain, there's been a lot of previous development that Nancy will talk about a little bit to develop a proprietary pulse algorithm. I'm under, of course, a confidentiality agreement. I don't need to say any more than that. There's some kind of a proprietary thing that has to be implemented. That's the underlying design that we're going after, along with all these other impacts that we're going for. For the no concern about injury, we have to have fault detection during the therapy, and we have to have limits on the settings. For the ability to adopt the TENS with confidence, the doctor, among other things, is going to need to have some setup sequence that's completely prompted. I don't have to go looking up in a manual. This thing tells me what to do first, what to do next, and how to handle it. Finally, to get the granting of clearance, to get the agency to grant clearance, we have to convince the agency that the safety profile is adequate. And believe me, when we actually submitted the 510K, we had to go back and forth because there was a very low-level junior reviewer looking at this thing, and you couldn't say enough to convince this guy to stick his neck out and actually say, yeah, it's okay. That's a long story I don't need to go into here, but you have to be convincing. There's more to the impact mapping than what I've shown you, but we find that this simple example, this compact example, shows the key things that are involved in the impact mapping. And as I say, I happen to think that kind of an impact map conveys better and more information than a classical marketing requirements document, and is flexible enough that you can work with it and modify it if you need to when you're in the middle of development, because you can go, we forgot something. Because it always happens, and it always will. And something like that, all the different stakeholders can say, you need something over here, or you need something there, because they can see it's drawn out. We highly recommend reading this book. It's short, very digestible, and it gives a lot of good food for thought. So by using the impact mapping, again, you don't have to pick any two. You align the different stakeholders because it's in the form that a lot of different people can understand. We keep our aim even if the target is moving. If somebody from the field says, you know, you'd sell a lot more if you had such and such feature, Nancy will talk about a case of that kind of thing. And you focus on behavior. This is getting in the heads of your customers. You focus on their behavior, you focus on what can drive behavior that you're looking for. So let's get out of that realm and into the safety aspect of it, because safety analysis is one of those things that you can't just do once. That's why it fits so well with the mapping and the Agile approach. Now, for medical devices, this document is the Holy Grail. This is the Bible. This is the thing that says you need to have a risk management process. ISO 14971. It talks about the stages and the phases and the things that you have to go through, and the fact that you should be doing it early and often. Who are the people that use it? You can see those things as well as I can. So it needs to iterate. The safety analysis and mitigation process needs to be an iterative one. Right? It's just like what you do with requirements or user stories, if you prefer to use that term, when you're doing Agile development. Early on, your user stories are going to be approximate, they're going to be high level. And as you get farther into your development, as you bite off chunks and work on them, you refine them and you make them more specific and you make them more detailed. The same thing happens in the safety realm. You start with a general knowledge of what your hazards are, and as you get farther along, you get a clearer knowledge of where those are going to occur and what the mitigations are, what things you need to do to avoid the particular risks that you've identified. And the document I just showed you says you need to do that early and often. There's more specific terminology in there, but that's what it means. So who should be the people who take part in this risk analysis? Well, okay, you're engineers, especially the electronic and mechanical people, because you're talking about things which actually contact a living human being. Well, how about the people who are going to use the devices or implant them? Physicians, nurses, other kinds of caregivers, right? How about patients who have used a similar device? What kinds of things have they experienced? All right, and in a different industry, you would be asking the same kinds of questions with the people who are relevant to that industry. If it were aviation, you should be talking to pilots. You should be talking to aerospace engineers or controllers. How about researchers who do research in the field that you're interested in this case, pain relief? Or people who are regulatory experts and who have seen similar devices, have seen similar things and worked through the issues in getting clearance for those. All right, these are all the kinds of people you would have contributing to a safety analysis. And how many in here are familiar with fault tree analysis? Use it in one way or another? We've got a smattering. It's a general, I don't need to go into specifics about the tool, but I've used this approach to exemplify how at the beginning of a project you can say in a general way what are the things we need to take into account. And then this gets more specific as you get farther in, and then you do your fault, failure, mode, and effects analysis. The possibilities are you can shock a patient, you can burn a patient, you could cause spasms, or you can cause some other device like an implanted device to fail, an implanted cardioverter defibrillator or an implanted pacemaker. In those two cases, don't use it near this kind of a device and don't apply it on the head or neck. All right, you can't go much farther down the tree than that. There are and or gates in here. The only reason I show this is that by doing this kind of analysis right up front, you can identify some user stories that are safety related. Here's 1, here's 2, here's 3, here's 4. Well, let's look at those stories. As a caregiver, I want to ensure that therapy will stop if there's a short, an open circuit, or high impedance detected by the device to avoid harming the patient. Notice that I've tried to use story language to express that. Or I want the unit to limit the therapy duration to avoid harming the patient. And similarly, I want the unit to prevent setting duration longer once the therapy has begun. That's kind of a special case of this one. And as a caregiver, I want the unit to prevent setting output too high to avoid harming the patient. So the two phrase is actually the same in every case because of the type of stories these are. When we did this out in an actual impact mapping, story mapping tool, I had the ability to define a separate kind of story, a separate kind of entity in that tool that was structured exactly the same as a user story, but I labeled it a risk story. And there was an advantage in that I could then easily find all the things that I had identified that were risk related and be able to show that to the person who would be reviewing the system. So that's a further detail on that. Now, in terms of risk analysis, I've sort of given away the answer to this question already. Is this once up front? The regulatory bodies expect you to be looking at this over and over throughout your development and beyond, even after the device has been issued to the marketplace. Partway into your development, this is something that could happen. Your key customer says, I need to control this thing via a remote. How might your company answer? That's a major change in design. What kind of safety issues do you think might arise? Would we revisit the hazard analysis? So is that hazard analysis ever complete? Just like features and user stories, do we ever know everything when our project begins? I don't need to ask that question too many times to an audience like this. Will we learn things about how it's being used once a potential user tries it out? I hope so. What other analyses can we do once we have a detailed design? Well, I made a brief mention of that right now. What are some of the other safety tools? Well, once we have a design, then we can go into failure mode and effects analysis and do the tabular thing. If this component fails, then, if this component fails, then, and so forth. But we can't do that until we have a design. And could we potentially bring other stakeholders in partway through development? So the whole risk management approach is a cyclic one. The American Society for Quality likes to use this cycle, the plan, do, check, act. That's like select your user stories, refine them, develop that portion, do a demonstration and get the feedback, and then build the feedback into your next iteration and keep going. Well, it's the same thing. And this predates Agile methodology. So at this point, notice your safety analysis gives you, this iterative approach gives you a sharper focus and allows you to incorporate information in flight. So the cheaper, faster, and better can all be achieved at the same time. And we sort of like to avoid accidents and recalls.
Okay, let's talk about story mapping now. Before I get into story mapping, I just want to say that impact mapping sets you up really nicely to start doing story mapping because it's already cemented now with the big features into real business goals because you started with a business goal, right? And then you're figuring out what sort of people do you need to reach and in what ways do you want to influence their behavior. And that's a really great kickoff point because often, before I heard of impact mapping, we would start by saying, okay, what features should there be? And everybody's hypothesizing, right? And a lot of times companies, marketing groups, or product management people don't have very much contact, at least not as much as they should, with real customers. So anyway, we're going to talk about story mapping now. And Jeff Patton is the person most known for story mapping. I'm just curious, this is a great turnout, by the way. How many people here already use story mapping? There were quite a few hands going up when David asked earlier how many people are. Okay, I see like 3 or 4 hands. Okay, so story mapping is new to a lot of people here. Jeff Patton has been talking about story mapping at a number of conferences and other events for several years now. And there's a book now out in early release, which is shown on this slide. And we're going to offer ebook copies of that in our raffle today. What I want to say about this is that we want to make sure that the product's going to fit the user, and we want to make sure that there's a fit over a timeline, that you have some sense about what things are needed early, what things are needed later. Story mapping really helps you turn a whole set of random ideas into a sequence of events that you want to make happen as you do your releases out to the market. And so this should be used by project managers, product managers too, marketing people, and the hands-on technical teams is who needs story mapping. Okay. Some basic keys here. Instead of reading a lot of words, I really wanted to show you an example. But to just say briefly, what we're going to do is there's a vertical axis in the story mapping board, and that vertical axis is where we're going to show time. The early releases at the top and the next ones and so on. The benefit of this is it helps make sure that each step of the way, you're releasing something that people are actually going to be able to use. And the reason that's important is because it's by getting feedback from real customers that we know where we stand in our project. That's how we know how done we are. Back years ago, when I was doing technical lead work in software teams and hardware teams as well, we were always using these Gantt charts, and we were always doing these crazy calculations where, my manager would say, well, what % done are you now? And, I'd count up the different tasks and which ones I had done, and I'd say, okay, I think I'm about 35% done this week, and I'm about 40%. So that was a tedious way to know how far along you are, how close to the goal are we. And there, you can imagine there's a lot of room for error and myth-making, especially as we got later into the project, right? Once I got to the point where I said I'm 90% done, and then I just discovered there's another half of the project ahead of me. And I'd have to each week start saying, well, I'm 91%, 91.5. So we don't want to do that. We just don't want to do that anymore. We want to get a sense directly from customers, or customer proxies. A lot of times with medical things, you can't just go out and try it on real people right away. You have to have some sort of controlled environment. But the same idea still applies. You want to get a real reading about, how far along am I? So that's really what the benefit of this is. And again, I'm just going to refer back to this picture that was shown earlier as Brian was talking about the TENS device. And I'm still talking about the one in the lower right-hand corner. It has a control panel that has a number of status lights on it and some buttons and the like. And essentially what you want to have happen on the user interface is when the doctor is running the procedure, they want to see how many minutes are left to go. They want to punch in, some parameters. And they have to hook up these electrodes. Okay, so we're going to talk about that a little bit as we look at this story map. Okay, now if you look at this across the top, you're going to see that there's these green boxes. There's nothing special about the color coding here. We're just trying to point out a few different kinds of activity. But right across the top row, that's a series of activities that our customer would be doing in the normal course of their work. So in the case of this device, what you'd want to do is you want to ask a doctor or a potential user, okay, what would a normal therapy session be like? What would you expect to do? Well, okay, they would attach the electrodes, they'd power up the device, okay, enter whatever treatment settings they're going to have, do some sort of signaling for when to start, right? Because you want to control that. Next to the last, well, now they're just going to let the thing do its job. So now the doctor is sort of monitoring the machine. And lastly, disconnect it. And what we see coming down in the rows are, okay, what we want to do is ask ourselves the question, how should the system support each one of these activities? It doesn't necessarily have to do something to support every single activity, because we want to have a continuous, sensible stream across the top. There could be some activities where you don't actively support, like that final activity. There isn't any feature under there helping them to disconnect it. It's just something you do, just to make the scenario complete. So let's take a look, just a little overview now of these releases. Let's say release 1, hypothetically, is a point where you're doing laboratory tests. So you're in a very controlled environment. You're trying out whether the therapy works, yeah? So you might want to power up the device and give some sort of a warning if the electrodes are shorted out or something like that. So that might be an early feature that we really want to have. So we want to go to some effort to put that in. For entering the treatment settings, it would make sense to prompt for them so that something doesn't get omitted, okay? Beginning the therapy, they have to have some way of setting what intensity there should be, right? You don't want to shock the patient, you don't want to go at the wrong levels. Okay, and so on. So you can see what will be happening. In the allow therapy to proceed, we have a pink box there. That's one of the safety stories. Comes from, it's a risk mitigation, in other words. Somebody did an analysis, identified a risk that could happen, and they want to mitigate that. So in this case, it says therapy ends when time limit reached. So we want some sort of a mechanism right in the system so that the therapy doesn't go on too long, right? Because then that can cause injury of some sort. Okay, so that's the first release. And then looking down at the second release a little bit later on, we might say, hey, you know, let's support this first activity about attaching electrodes. Why don't we mechanically key it so that it can't go in the wrong way? You know, that would be a good feature. That can go in later. All right? So, and so on across the different releases. We've labeled these as feasibility study and pivotal study because those tend to be the sequences that you would do in a medical device. And there might be more than one release, you know, in any one of those phases. But we're moving from a very controlled environment to an environment that's a little bit less tightly controlled as we go down the releases. Any questions?
I have a question. So,
Microphone?
So in release 2, you've got two types of activities there. One, you know, you've got some software development activities, but then if you try to do something around like leads keyed for correct polarity, you might have to do some tooling, you know, for plastics and things like that. So those typically work on different kinds of timelines. You know, so I don't know how you would say it's release 2, but one thing may have a longer time horizon that's asynchronous to the other thing. So
Yeah, and that's the very reason why we would want to be looking ahead several releases. You know, when we're first thinking about the big features that this ought to have, we might want to lay out 3, 4, maybe even more releases than that, just so that we can look ahead for that very reason, that some things that might involve stuff that's harder to change, you can be thinking ahead about it. Or you might group, if possible, related changes into a certain time period, you know, when you're going to have those people available. Is there another hand a little further back? Do you want to say something?
Yeah, and indeed, if you're doing in laboratory types of tests, you may be using prototype things that are being built as a one-off while tooling is being developed, so that you can then say, you know, don't go too far with developing that tooling. We're partway into finalizing the device of this keying or whatever, like the design of this keying. So there are ways of approaching that, even that. And we had a presentation, I think, at this session some months ago about 3D printing, where 3D printing can be used to create prototypes of certain kinds of housings and enclosures, for example, that you'd be able to use in testing on earlier revisions while longer-term tooling is being developed.
So the other,
Okay.
We've already moved to the
Yeah.
other questioner in the back.
Sorry about that.
We'll give you a chance after.
I'm assuming that there may be some level of iteration even within, as you're figuring this stuff out. The thing that struck my mind was when you had the example of the risk of too much therapy, therefore we want to have a time limit. Well, obviously, maybe we better make sure there's a time limit in that initial setup, because we might not have thought about that until a later release.
Yep, very good point. And that's exactly what this is meant to do. It's meant to be a catalyst that helps you bring together all these different viewpoints, okay, different aspects. By having something like this, it almost acts like the central part of a group brain, you know what I mean? So that everybody's literally going off the same page or the same storyboard, so to speak. Did you want to follow up with something?
the other question, or the other comment, is that as you're doing the iterative releases, and one of the things that's required as part of the device I'm developing is, you have to do your formative usability studies. And so you have to start collecting data as part of your portfolio that you provide to the FDA for your clearance. So there's formative, summative type of validation.
Yeah, that's the usability
Yeah,
side
so
of it.
you want to do that in parallel, like 62366, so
Right.
that's something I have to do.
Those are somewhat parallel to the feasibility and pivotal studies. Those terms only apply when you're doing a PMA device and
No.
honest to goodness.
No.
I'm not talking about formative summative, I'm talking about feasibility and pivotal.
Yeah.
Feasibility and
You have to
pivotal
do-
apply to the actual clinical trials
FDA
are being done for a PMA
Well,
device.
so the device I'm working with, FDA is pretty stringent now in applying usability
Right.
practices.
And the usability practices are being required in a lot of areas, and the formative, summative. All I'm saying is that formative and summative are somewhat parallel to the feasibility and pivotal. As your formative studies are frequent and with small groups, your summative has to be a final with a much larger group, and those are similar to what we've labeled as feasibility and pivotal here.
I don't think it's the size of the group that's really.
It's not the key element, but it can be one of the differences. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We had another question over here, let's not Let's give him a chance.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's take one more question, and then I'll go along and leave deeper questions till our Q&A time. Go ahead.
Just a question between teachers and risk, as I was following your discussion, especially during the laboratory tests. I was thinking, well, why is give warning if electrode it's shorted? Why is that yellow and not pink?
A good point that you bring up. That's the reason for having something like this that's accessible to a large number of stakeholders. Mechanical, electrical engineers, as well as project managers, as well as marketing people are going to need to look at this. And in some contexts, that might be something where somebody could walk up to that and say, that should be considered a risk item. So, good catch, good call.
Yeah, I have a little bit on that coming up though. But thanks for the question. You're already watching here. All right, let me just make the point that, so anything you see vertically lined up under one of these user activities, that's the set of evolving ways that the system is going to support that activity. So in this case of power up the device, in the early release, we'll give a warning about the electrode being shorted. In a later release, we'll add this item here, confirm which leads are connected. And later on, we might do this. We might do a complete power on self test, along with, here's a pink box, which represents for us a risk mitigation story, which says ensure that the outputs are initially at 0. And so I'm just making the point here about these vertical sections across here. You might ask a question on this. Somebody might ask, and I'll just throw it out there. If it's really important to ensure that the outputs are at 0, why are we waiting until the 3rd iteration? Why don't we try to get all those right in the very first one? Anybody got an answer for that? Go ahead. Oh, Mike, you need a mic.
Thank you. Too many things could have happened that could have changed that, so you want to test that near the end because some other change might have, that was working, but no, it's no longer working.
Well, that could be. This is one of these things where there's no wrong answer, I don't think. But what I had in mind was, just because something's important doesn't mean you have to get all of it in iteration 1, otherwise we're back to waterfall, right? So it's really important that the outputs initially be at 0. I mean, you want to avoid injury, right? Maybe we're making sure of that in the first release by checklists that clinicians are manually enforcing. That doesn't show up here on the board, okay? So anything that's really important, especially for a safety situation, that we haven't got the system automated to do and support adequately and been tested, anything of that nature, we're just going to make sure it happens anyway, right? We're just going to get people to pay attention. Use checklists, use whatever you got to use. And so I can see a number of checklist type things disappearing over time as the system learns to do those things. It's really just like the difference between checking your own tire pressure and having a fancier car that checks it for you continuously and puts it on the dashboard, that kind of thing.
And for this kind of unit as well, for this kind of development, your laboratory testing may not even be on a living being at all, but being done in a laboratory where you're connected up to a phantom with something to measure the voltages and observe the pulses that you're applying. Then you might, in later studies in feasibility type work, move to laboratory animals to see whether their behavior changes if you're able to relieve their pain, but still not being applying to a human. And then do controlled studies with volunteers at a later stage. So those may actually, those phases may correspond to the ways that you're going about testing.
Okay, I'm going to move along now, and I'm going to look at another little close-up here about that first step, attaching the electrodes. Nothing supporting it by the system here in the first release, but in the next one, we've got the leads key for correct polarity. Somebody I think already mentioned it, but I wanted to call it out specifically. Okay, so here's a story that's a mechanical story. It's not even software, it's not even electronic. Another feature, another good thing about story maps is they help you think in terms of the whole product. So whatever technologies need to come together, it doesn't matter whether it's material science, whether it's optics, whether it's electronic, whatever. Wherever it needs to come together, and of course you've got some flexibility in where you're going to implement these things. Now you can use that flexibility. Okay, so it automatically helps you think the right way as you blend the different technologies. Here's another close-up look at the enter treatment settings column. You might see, okay, down here, I'm putting the attention on this risk mitigation, that the duration must be less than 30 minutes. Now someone might say, that story could have just as well come from somebody putting conditions of satisfaction on an ordinary story. You know, consider a treatment done. You know, no treatment lasts more than 30 minutes, so just end it there. Could have come from there. But in this case, it actually came from, you know, the risk analysis that Brian showed you a few minutes earlier. And so why is it important? Why should we even care where it came from, right? My answer is, if it came from a risk mitigation, that's special. That's a different parentage than if it just came from the customer's wish list. It's a different parentage in the sense that I want to make sure I don't accidentally change that or defeat the purpose of it, because that's been the source of a lot of software accidents or software caused accidents that, you know, happened. Everybody's heard the horror stories. And, you know, silently defeating a risk mitigation is one of those things. So if it is in there for that reason, it's good to tag it that way, to track it like that in your traceability. Somebody mentioned another one earlier that was on the yellow card and said, shouldn't that be a risk mitigation? Well, maybe it should. But see, just showing it up prompts somebody to ask the question. You know, should something be considered a different characteristic of showing it?
And tagging the risk mitigation especially is also one of those, oh, by the way, you're going to have to show this to somebody that's going to clear you to sell that product. As I was saying to Michael a little bit earlier, you don't do compliance for compliance sake. You do good engineering and compliance comes out of it.
Good point. Okay, so let's look at this one. Brian mentioned this briefly in the previous section. Suppose our market says to us, okay, now in our next iteration, after the ones shown on the board, iteration 4, we want to have a remote control device instead of walking up to the panel and entering things. Suppose we're doing our risk analysis on that. Can anybody think of a risk associated with having a remote control? You want to go again?
Lose a signal between the remote and the base.
Yeah, that's a good one. Can we think of another risk?
Get a false signal from some other device that is inadvertently affecting this device.
Yeah, receiving a false signal. Anybody got more? Somebody in the back has one. Oh, there's 2 in the back. Oh, we can have fun with this.
This might be a little too basic. Could you lose the remote?
Lose the remote. Nothing is too basic.
Yeah, if the wife gets a hold of that remote, look out. I was gonna say security. Security, especially with medical devices, everybody's always worried about somebody's gonna hack my pacemaker.
Yeah. All right. Well, you did flag a couple of the ones we thought we'd call out on here. Those were all really great answers. I love the one about losing the remote. You know it's going to happen. Was there another one in the back too?
And if you don't show all of the outputs that the panel has, then the person who's programming it won't know, for instance, whether the leads are actually attached correctly.
Oh yeah, the remote control would also have to repeat the display things perhaps. That's a thought too. I hadn't, okay. You've been doing this before, I can tell. Okay, so the point I'm making here though is this encourages you, it shows you why you have to revisit your risk analysis. One of the things that happens is companies make doing the risk analysis into such a horrible chore and such a drawn out mess that once they got it done, they never want to do it again. But that's just what we used to do with testing until Agile came along and said, wait a minute, test is important, so let's do more of it, not less. So let's quit making it such a chore so that we do it more frequently like we should. The same thing with this, it's the same point. So coming back to the overall picture here, again, I want to point out another item here that I think is interesting. And It's the second to the last user activity up there, where the doctor is allowing the therapy to proceed. Basically, the customer is not the actor now. The machine is. It's the same as when you're on a flight. For the big portion in the middle, the autopilot's doing the work, and the pilots are pretty much along for the ride, and, you know, check into something that can go wrong. So, but that's very true in most all embedded systems, at least pretty much all the ones. I think everything I've worked on has this kind of a pattern to it. I just think it's interesting. So the system is doing stuff, and you notice there's quite a lot going on in that vertical column too, right? And there's a lot of things happening there, of course. There would be. I want to point out another thing too, though. I just put the red circle around this story called Deliver Proprietary Pulses. Yeah, it's on here on a little yellow box, just like all the other stories, and, you know, just for the record, stories are small, divided up requirements, just packaged small. Okay, and so it's on there just like any other story, as if somebody dreamed it up like 2 or 3 iterations ago, and of course it isn't like that. This is a special story. It's got a different kind of parentage, in the sense that this was a whole research project to figure it out. It's the whole reason why this product is being built, so it's not just an incidental story like put another button on the panel. So it comes from a prior research project where it was the whole topic of it. And so then you might think about, oh, there's sort of like a genealogy of projects in a sense. So here it is. Here's the TENS project that we're talking about right now over at the right, and this previous project to really investigate and develop what these proprietary pulses are. And that might have been preceded by somebody's PhD work. And nothing says that the TENS product doesn't incorporate other things that were developed, maybe not as research projects, maybe as just full-blown other subsystems that we buy from somewhere. But you know, you kind of always have this type of a product genealogy, don't you? Just another thing that story mapping helps you think about. So coming back to the big picture here, the point I want to make is that story mapping helps you bring a timeline view to the blending of all the different technologies that are going on. Not just the different technologies, but the different functions in your company that have to come together to build a whole product. So this gives the marketing people a chance to talk to the technical people. You could even bring in actual customers, and they should be able to understand what's in your story map. They might even have an opinion about what features they'd rather have earlier than later. And the customer, one of the things that makes this so useful is that we start with the customer by beginning the whole story map with that row across the top, which is a scenario, a real usage scenario of how the product's to be used. And there could be more than one scenario. We can have more than one story map for a given product. I just always start with the plain vanilla, way it's going to be used most of the time in normal use. Okay, I think now it's Brian's turn to talk a little bit about a traceability that knits together the impact mapping and the story mapping.
I'll back up first to this diagram. And the tools that we've seen for doing these kinds of mapping, we actually hook each of the subsequent things to whatever its parent was. We have connect them. And there would be lines. It just would clutter this diagram way too much to put the lines on there. But anything that supports the attach electrode story that's connected to it. So those in the tool are, those traces, those connections are tracked. And I took a portion of the Excel export from this particular tool to show here. And so I went from the very top, from the business goal down to the actor, and you notice in each case, we're going to connect back up to the next higher level. So here's an impact that says it came from A2, from actor number 2. Here's a deliverable that came from impact number 6. Here's a user activity that relates to these two particular deliverables. And then here is a risk management story that came out of this particular user activity. So the traceability becomes complete and becomes automatic in the process that you're following to create the map for the product. So it's not a separate thing that you have to do to sit there and, I don't know, what's this trace to? And oh, by the way, in this particular tool, you can define not only your conditions of satisfaction, those conditions of satisfaction could be executable tests. So the tests then trace to the particular stories, which trace to the users, which trace, and so forth and so on. So there's a complete traceability that's a part of the activity we're carrying out, not a separate thing that we have to do. So we've got these benefits of doing the story mapping. All of the stories relate somehow to specific user activities that we lay out in a sequence, and we've checked that sequence, we've mind-checked that sequence against the user to say, is this the way that you go about doing this? Specific stories we can identify as risk mitigations so that we can prevent them being abrogated at a later time, and so that we can collect them up and say, here, Mr. Regulator, this is what we've done for our risk mitigations. We can see where hardware and software features connect to each other, and we can also plan the development of different kinds of things in different timelines, and as you saw from the way that Nancy was developing that. And that column-wise view shows us evolving support for a given activity as we add particular features that we can put on in later phases to make it a more complete product. Because that's the whole essence of Agile. We make a partial product, get our feedback, make it even more complete product, get some more feedback, and we build it up as we go along. The story mapping is a highly organic way of being able to do that development. So again, this means we don't have to pick any two. By showing a timeline view, which is our user activities that become technical features, we can support a cross-functional dialogue. And it's very often happened that people of very different backgrounds have come up to the same story map and say, well, this should really be thus and such. Or this one belongs down here. Or this one, So mechanical engineering can come over the same story map and say, we're going to need to do thus and such in order to help this over here. And the marketing people can say, oh, I get it now. Yeah, that makes sense for the kinds of users we have, or whatever. So Agile, we like to think of as a way of connecting the silos, that we've kind of been hinting at as we've been going along, of getting different people involved and participating in that development process from right up front. We were just having a conversation with a client on the phone, a client over in Scotland, who were worried about their final verification stage. We've got a separate validation group, and they feel like they have to do all the development of their own stuff. Well, why not involve them early? Why not get them involved in helping build these maps? They can be working on developing specific kinds of tests while the early development of the product is happening. They can be running certain of those tests as a later version of the product is available, and so forth. There you go.
I get to talk about my magic boxes now. Okay, so we had this little mystery box at the beginning where I said I would clear up some of what's going on inside of there. So we're going to change that question mark to a check mark. We've covered some impact mapping. We've covered iterative safety analysis. We've just gone over story mapping in some detail. So now what I'm trying to do is show for you that we've removed a little bit of the mystery about why things can get done quicker. You can see how much confusion and working across purposes can simply go away when everybody's really operating off the same map, so to speak. So this mysterious stuff down here for the Agile teams, that goes away too. It's not like, I'm going to go back one. It's not like there was some mysterious cleanup stage that magically got rid of all the bugs and shrank time. That's not really what happened. What happened was instead, we came up with the feature ideas and we built the hardware and software in a totally different way from the ground up. And that's what allowed us to have a much cleaner product, much quicker. Okay, and so there's not really a mystery. You actually can get high quality with speed. In fact, I like to say that speed is a side effect of working in a super high quality way, because you just get rid of so much rework. That you seem to be going faster, even though you're not rushing around, you're not scrambling and talking super fast, You're just eliminating all that waste so that you can actually think. And the reverse is never true. You're never going to get quality by putting speed first, right? If you prioritize speed over everything else, you don't get quality. It's not a side effect. This reminds me of A little story, a friend of mine does web development. She was on a team. She says, Nancy, you know all that Agile stuff you teach all the time. Yeah, well, they told me I'm on an Agile team. But she says, I don't get it. They put us in one room. We all sit at this table all day long, and we have to rush and hurry. I said, I don't think that's Agile. She says, and I said, doesn't sound like it to me. So their way of being Agile was to just stick everybody in a boiler room and tell them to work extra fast. So there's this misconception out there around speed, and hope we can do a little myth busting on that today. So that's the mystery box wrapped up. Okay, what are we going to talk about next? Oh yeah, I want to make the point too that we've emphasized these 3 techniques, and I don't want anybody to go away thinking, oh, if I get those 3, then I'm Agile, then I know all I need to know about Agile. These are foundations along with some other things like test-driven development, like continuous integration. I mean, those are the technical practices that allow you to be able to keep up your testing along with the speed of development. So, I mean, it's not one or the other. It's not, that's more important than this. These all go together. So I just wanted to say that. Just didn't want to take the chance of leaving anybody with a misimpression around that. And Brian, you want to say something about silos? He hates my mixed metaphor.
Yeah.
But now he uses it all the time.
Bridging silos, something like bringing the ship of state to its knees. I go somehow that doesn't ring right with me. How many companies have you seen that R&D and engineering talk freely with clinical and support, or talk freely with marketing? Hello, excuse me, this is not coming. What we need to do is do the connecting. So, I figured if I was going to mix the metaphors, I'd make them as mixed as possible. And these kinds of maps do that because they're relatively straightforward to understand. So all the kinds of stakeholders who need to be part of it can see all of the stuff and say, we need to break this out, or that really needs to be a risk mitigation, or whatever. So lots of people can take part of them. And we've got our 3 gears here again for the 3 different elements that we talked about in the technology. We don't need to pick any 2 of the goals. We can get the cheaper, better, and faster all at the same time. Now, bear in mind, at least in the medical field, and Nancy addressed some of the other fields that are safety critical as well, there is no regulatory body that requires waterfall methods anymore, to my knowledge. Even DO 178B, which used to be waterfall-centric, has been changed and is no longer waterfall-centric in the DO 178C for the aviation area.
Yeah, the 178s now explicitly say they're not mandating any type of life cycle.
For the regulatory bodies, nobody says you can't use an Agile method. And now that AMI, the Association for Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, has come out with a guidance that says if you want to use Agile in the medical device software area, here are the things you want to be looking at, you want to consider. That's TIR 45. So now and there were FDA people on the panel that helped put together that document. So yeah, you can do the Agile approach in a medical device development situation. As John Murray put it in the course that Nancy and I attended back in April, if you're going to, you can use Agile, but you better use good Agile. Do it right. You must always demonstrate conformance to predetermined requirements, but nobody says that those predetermined requirements have to be determined right up at the beginning. You could predetermine them prior to implementing them, which can be anywhere along in a project. So this has more than the impact on things like TENS devices. We have a growing area of things that are connected to the internet. I mean, I have a blood pressure device which I control by Bluetooth from my smartphone. I have a scale that I stand on every morning that wirelessly transmits the weight data along with percent fat to a website that then I connect with and get my data. So there's 10 billion internet things, internet devices today of various kinds, expected to be 30 billion, and the fastest growing area is going to be the medical area, in-home devices, mobile devices, things being used by elderly people, intelligence sensors, that sort of stuff. So we need to have quality that's built in rather than discovered after the fact for an adequate level of safety as this kind of development goes forward. And that's pretty well wraps that up.
You should say something about SDMD.
And it's exactly what I was hoping to do at this point. Has anybody here gotten the email that was sent out through Constant Contact that came out under my Shoemaker Associates name? Jim, I might have had you on my list.
Oh, I did.
There was an email right after Labor Day that went out. There was an invitation to software design for medical devices. It's going to be happening here in the Boston area, October 27th and 28th. We've got a stellar lineup of speakers. Don Woodlock is a VP at General Electric, GE Health, will be a keynote talker at that, and we have an expert on infusion pumps giving a workshop on risk management. So we've got quite a lineup of great speakers on the two-day conference.
And there will be a few sessions about Agile as it relates to medical too.
So I strongly recommend you take a look at that. Anybody that hasn't gotten that announcement, stop by. I'll give you my business card, and give me some information, and I'll make sure to forward to you the information about it. But it is on my website.
It's on ours too.
No, it is on the ANU website as well. If you link to it and use either Nancy's information or my information, you get a 15% off on the price of the conference. So make sure to use that.
Okay, now we have time for questions. Let's have more questions. Way in the back. You didn't know what you were in for volunteering to run around with Mike, did you?
Hi, I'm very interested in traceability, and I would like to ask the question, do you have one-to-one mapping essentially from the one end of your documentation chain to the others? And more specifically, when you discover new features as bugs, as defects, do they work themselves all the way up to the front and appear as part of the requirements?
The mapping isn't always one-to-one, because you may have a particular impact that maps down to several different features, or a feature that may map down to several different elements in the sequence of user activities. Or you may end up having to create, for a very large product, several different sequences of activities that chain back to the same impact map. So it's not always a one-to-one mapping. It will be one from above to many below. It rarely goes many below to one, one below to many above, but that's a complication we don't need to worry about here. The beauty of the mapping approach is you are forced to say, well, what does this connect with? What does this have to do with? When you drop something new into that map, you need to connect it to whatever is its parent.
Right.
And then drop, if it's a new activity in the sequence that you didn't realize before, you got to say, okay, what is this supporting? And then what are the user stories that support it? So the traceability is something that you can maintain as you need to modify and expand that map. So if you're using tooling to be able to do this, it should be relatively straightforward as you're modifying or adding things to your map to keep the traceability complete, because that thing that I showed that was a partial spreadsheet output, that's a dump from the tool.
Yes,
That's an export from the tool, and it tells you, whatever the parents were for any given thing in the row.
So all of your defects map into the other end of the documentation chain?
If a defect ends up spawning a new feature, and we may be just using different terminology for the same thing, absolutely. If a defect is, this should work that way, then the feature is already there in the map and you've taken care of it.
Right, so any mechanical, electrical, all that stuff can eventually, any defect could conceivably pop up new features?
Yes.
And what tool are you using?
This tool that we used to try this out was something from Tech Talk in Austria that's called SpecLog. I have it on my PC and I can actually show it to you if you want a little bit before we go.
There are details about it in the back end of our slides, which are already up on the website if you want to download them.
Just like to reach out to the community. I'm interested in some kind of a public domain traceability tool. If anybody is using such or is interested in perhaps participating in the evolution of such a thing, please let me know.
Okay, do you want to say your name?
My name is Eric.
Okay.
I'm interested, how do I get in contact?
Okay,
I'll be here after the.
okay,
My
you'll
name's
be
Eric
here in the
Houston.
network period, or you
My
can post
email-
on A&E.
My email is eric.houston.02138, the most opinionated zip code in the United States, at gmail.com.
All right,
Eric.houston.02138.
okay, we got that.
And I'm going to try to reach out to the academic community to try to, or Open Software Foundation to sponsor such things. I think this is a real problem for all of us in the software world, is not having cheap traceability, excellent traceability tools.
Okay, thanks for your comments. Do we have more questions?
Yes, back here. Hi, Nancy.
Hi.
I've used story maps that have had a couple of hundred stories with index cards on the wall. I have used a story map with more than a couple of hundred stories electronically in the box. And I have done smaller story maps, which I've actually used Visio for to create and have had much better success. I'm wondering what your experience as far as the size of story maps and the manipulation of it has been.
Well, I don't think that for, most modern rail projects, you can stay entirely with a paper system. I mean, I like using it for the immediate iteration so that people can interact more quickly and easily right in the team room. I like that. But once the iteration is passed, I just record the higher level information in some electronic tool. It varies with all the teams I work with. Most of them tend to use whatever tool comes with the platform that company works with, right? I mean, each of the major platforms has tools for it. And everybody's got their different preferences. So at some point, you've got to record things electronically. So I believe in having tools that do a lot of, take the drudgery out of it. Otherwise, you're just creating more opportunity for problems.
But when you're actually working in it, you limit your story map to a reasonable number of items.
This came up in a conversation we had just the other day too, and the word partition was kind of the key word.
Yes.
Find ways to break your groups of
Yes.
things into categories or sequences. So you might have multiple maps showing different portions of the sequence of events, or some other way of partitioning stuff, because the human brain just can't handle all of that stuff at once. So a sensible way of partitioning your information is absolutely essential as you get into larger projects.
You'd noticed in the mapping you were doing, there's a fairly specific tagging of these are the risk critical things. I'm just curious if you've ever run into a situation where you actually needed to have more than one tagging in order to be able to pull things out because you were dealing with more than one set of regular, the thing that came to mind, I used to serve a submarine, so there's a very specific set of things you had to deal with submarines. Now, the corpsman on the submarine had to deal with both the medical world and the submarine world, and it was one of the reasons why it took him a year to get qualified. His hair was always gray. So I was wondering.
That's funny that you mentioned that. I used to work on submarine systems too. All that Hunt for Red October stuff, all those radar scopes and stuff. That's in one of my past lives. We did that. Okay. So anyway, to answer your question, I always see teams needing and wanting to tag things different ways. And I would like the tool to be able to do this sort of thing for you. I don't know off the top of my head if the one that we chose, that we were using actually gives you that feature, but it's fair game. If you think it's a useful feature, why not? Why not try it out? Agile's about experimenting and learning from your own experience. So, and the tool vendors want to support things too. They don't want to be in our way.
As it happened, the particular tool that we work with, we don't have any examples from that tool up here, except we used it to be able to develop this talk. It had one unassigned, you could create one more category of what they call a requirement, but was really a card. That's what I used to create the risk story. But there's nothing to say that one can't go get back with the vendor and say, hey, look, in the real world, we need multiple kinds of special categories because, and to say, you need to have that in your next version. And they'll go, if we can sell this many more copies of that tool, we'll put it in there.
Okay, did that have to be the last question? Okay, that was the last question.
The books,
Thank you.
including. Thank you, Brian.